Solomon's mind was a labyrinth of intellect, curiosity, and ambition, shaped by legacy, expectation, and the extraordinary access to power. From the moment he ascended to kingship, he inherited not only a kingdom, but the psychological weight of David's legacy, a legacy of courage, triumph, failure, and moral complexity. Psychologically, Solomon's early consciousness was conditioned by dual pressures: the desire to honor the moral and spiritual heritage of his father, and the necessity to establish his own identity and authority. This dual imperative created a mind primed for deep reflection, strategic thinking, and complex moral reasoning, yet also vulnerable to overextension, indulgence, and the seductions of ego. Wisdom, in Solomon's case, was not simply a cognitive trait, but a multidimensional psychological construct. It required integrating observation, analysis, ethical reasoning, foresight, and emotional regulation. Psychologically, wisdom involves the capacity to discern patterns beyond immediate perception, to anticipate consequences over time, and to navigate the interplay between human ambition and ethical principle. Solomon's famous request for wisdom demonstrates a metacognitive awareness. He recognized that intelligence without moral grounding is insufficient for effective leadership. This early insight reflects a mature psychological capacity for self-reflection, ethical prioritization, and strategic foresight. Solomon's cognitive architecture was oriented towards synthesis. He absorbed the complexity of human behavior, governance, and divine law, integrating these into frameworks for judgment and administration. Psychologically, this required exceptional executive function, pattern recognition, memory integration, and probabilistic reasoning all functioning in tandem. His decisions, famously illustrated in the judgment of the two mothers claiming the same child, reveal advanced moral cognition, the ability to perceive truth beyond superficial claims, to anticipate psychological responses, and to calibrate action to both justice and social cohesion. The mind capable of such discernment demonstrates nuanced theory of mind, empathy, and practical intelligence. The psychology of authority is central to Solomon's inner landscape. Power introduces both cognitive opportunity and emotional strain. Solomon's mind navigated complex social hierarchies, internal court dynamics, and external geopolitical pressures. Leadership psychology requires continuous assessment of loyalty, intention, and risk, alongside emotional regulation to maintain composure and strategic coherence. Solomon's capacity to integrate ethical principle with political pragmatism exemplifies advanced cognitive emotional synthesis, the ability to act decisively while anticipating ripple effects across social, political, and moral domains. Solomon's emotional and relational intelligence were tightly interwoven with his cognitive capacities. While intellect allowed him to plan, judge, and strategize, emotional acuity allowed him to maintain alliances, understand interpersonal dynamics, and navigate the subtleties of influence. The human mind at the intersection of cognition and emotion develops what psychologists term social metacognition, the ability to infer others' intentions, anticipate reactions, and modulate behavior to optimize relational and strategic outcomes. Solomon's marriages, alliances, and negotiations illustrate both the strengths and vulnerabilities inherent in this psychological integration. Creativity in Solomon's psychology manifests across architecture, literature, and diplomacy. The construction of the temple, the composition of proverbs and songs, and the negotiation of peace treaties all reflect cognitive integration of abstraction, symbolic reasoning, and practical execution. Creativity, in this context, is not mere artistic expression, but a form of problem-solving and relational communication. The creative mind synthesizes multiple streams of input, observation, precedent, intuition, and principle into solutions that are simultaneously functional, symbolic, and ethical. Solomon's genius lies in this cognitive synthesis, the ability to transform complex, competing variables into coherent structures, whether physical, social, or intellectual. Yet Solomon's mind was not immune to tension and vulnerability. The psychology of indulgence, temptation, and cognitive overload emerges as a counterpoint to wisdom. His access to power, wealth, and influence introduced psychological risks: ego inflation, overconfidence, attachment to pleasure, and distraction from moral and ethical imperatives. Human cognition, when amplified by resource abundance, often encounters challenges of impulse regulation, attentional control, and long-term planning. Solomon's later life illustrates the interplay of cognitive sophistication with emotional and moral susceptibility. Intellect without restraint, insight without prudence, and strategy without ethical anchoring can create internal dissonance and external instability. The tension between ideal and real is a central psychological theme in Solomon's life. The mind capable of abstract principle perceives discrepancy between moral ideal and lived reality. Solomon's awareness of injustice, moral compromise, and human frailty generates both cognitive insight and emotional the simultaneous recognition of what ought to be and what is. Psychologically, this creates reflective tension. The mind oscillates between aspiration and observation, between judgment and empathy, between criticism and acceptance. Solomon's writings, including the Reflections in Ecclesiastes, reveal this cognitive-emotional dynamic, acute awareness of impermanence, limitation, and paradox. Solomon's spirituality is integral to his psychology. His cognition was deeply intertwined with theological reflection, understanding divine principle, moral expectation, and human responsibility. Spiritual cognition provides a framework for interpreting events, making ethical decisions, and cultivating resilience. For Solomon, spiritual attunement was both a source of insight and a cognitive stabilizer, enabling him to navigate uncertainty, complexity, and moral ambiguity with coherence. Faith functions as a psychological scaffold, a lens through which ethical evaluation, relational judgment, and strategic planning can be integrated into a consistent framework for action. The psychology of reflection and introspection is pronounced in Solomon. Human cognition thrives on metacognition, the capacity to think about thinking, to evaluate decisions, anticipate consequences, and consider ethical implications. Solomon's introspective writings suggest a mind continuously engaged in self-evaluation, moral reasoning, and existential inquiry. This reflective orientation, while a source of wisdom, also introduces emotional and cognitive strain. Awareness of limitation, awareness of mortality, and awareness of ethical tension are persistent cognitive demands. Such awareness produces both insight and melancholy, clarity and doubt. The integration of judgment, fairness, and authority demonstrates advanced executive functioning in Solomon's mind. The human capacity for decision-making under uncertainty requires synthesis of data, prediction of outcomes, and ethical calibration. Solomon's judgments exemplify anticipatory cognition, the ability to foresee social, relational, and ethical consequences, and to calibrate action to maximize justice, coherence, and relational stability. Leadership psychology under such conditions is a high-order cognitive-emotional integration. Decision-making, ethical reasoning, relational insight, and strategic foresight functioning simultaneously under conditions of uncertainty and consequence. The psychological impact of legacy is pervasive in Solomon's consciousness. Awareness of ancestral expectation, historical precedent, and generational responsibility introduces both motivational drive and cognitive pressure. Solomon's mind continuously negotiated the balance between honoring legacy and establishing individual agency. Psychologically, this manifests as a tension between conformity and innovation, obligation and creativity, continuity and differentiation. Leadership under these conditions requires nuanced self-regulation, strategic thinking, and moral resilience. The paradox of wisdom and indulgence highlights an enduring psychological theme. Access to resources, authority, and influence introduces temptation, ego inflation, and attentional distraction. The mind, highly capable in abstraction and ethical reasoning, is simultaneously vulnerable to impulse, desire, and the seductions of immediate gratification. Solomon's psychological journey illustrates that wisdom alone does not inoculate against human vulnerability. Cognitive sophistication must be accompanied by self-regulation, ethical anchoring, and reflective practice. Awareness of limitation, ethical tension, and susceptibility is a hallmark of mature cognitive emotional integration. Solomon's relational psychology underscores the importance of social cognition in leadership. His capacity to perceive intention, anticipate reaction, and modulate influence demonstrates advanced social metacognition. Effective relational navigation requires integration of empathy, ethical awareness, strategic insight, and emotional regulation. Solomon's court, diplomacy, and alliances illustrate the continuous exercise of these faculties. He negotiated competing interests, mediated disputes, and maintained stability within a complex social network. Human social cognition at this level is both a cognitive and emotional achievement, requiring sustained attention, adaptive insight, and principled flexibility. Mortality and legacy inform the existential dimension of Solomon's psychology. The human mind, aware of finitude, integrates reflections on impermanence, continuity, and moral contribution. Solomon's writings exhibit heightened existential cognition, awareness of time, transience, human limitation, and the consequences of action. Such awareness fosters moral reflection, strategic foresight, and ethical prioritization, yet also introduces cognitive and emotional tension. Recognition of impermanence can inspire both humility and melancholy, ethical vigilance, and reflective anxiety. The synthesis of wisdom, creativity, moral reasoning, and relational intelligence defines Solomon's psychological profile. His mind integrated observation, reflection, ethical evaluation, strategic insight, emotional awareness, and spiritual attunement. Psychologically, this integration represents advanced executive functioning, social cognition, moral reasoning, and emotional intelligence. Solomon's cognitive architecture allowed him to navigate complexity, ambiguity, and ethical tension with adaptive resilience, generating outcomes of justice, stability, and cultural enrichment. Solomon's reflective capacity, tempered by vulnerability and human limitation, illustrates the balance of cognitive and emotional integration. Wisdom is not merely intelligence, it is the ability to synthesize knowledge, ethical principle, emotional perception, and relational awareness into coherent action. Solomon exemplifies this integration, yet also reveals the inherent tension. The mind, capable of profound insight, is also vulnerable to distraction, indulgence, and moral compromise. Awareness of this duality is itself a facet of advanced psychological functioning, recognition of strength and limitation, virtue and susceptibility, insight and temptation. In summation, the psychology of Solomon exemplifies the interplay of intellect, ethical reasoning, emotional depth, creativity, strategic foresight, social cognition, and spiritual attunement. His life illustrates the integration of cognitive sophistication with emotional complexity, ethical reflection with practical decision-making, and relational insight with personal ambition. Solomon's mind demonstrates that human psychology, when cultivated through reflection, experience, and principled engagement, achieves a synthesis capable of navigating extreme complexity, moral ambiguity, and relational intricacy with enduring impact and lasting legacy.